but we're at over 100, I think, hopefully. 89. Okay. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Let's recap. The 1840 election, we saw North-South tension emerge. Okay, good. John Tyler was one of the people who was most blamed for the Civil War, the president most blamed for the Civil War, in part because he kind of breaks the Whig Party, right? He's the vice presidential candidate, he becomes president, and then he basically does nothing that the Whig Party wants, acts entirely on his own, and is even more of a states' rights supporter than the Democratic Party is, so he brings in just Southerners to his cabinet. He annexes Mexico basically by fiat and helps usher in this war, the war that Polk ultimately wins or that the U.S. ultimately wins against Mexico for Texas. In 1841, fiat is basically just by declaration. He just basically declares that Texas is annexed, even though bringing in a state is supposed to have been voted on by Congress. He just says it's we've annexed Texas without any conference at all with Congress. Good morning. Okay, so again, in 1841 to 48, the states default on their loan. Mississippi never pays. This matters a lot when we talk about the war. The Walker Tariff increases U.S. revenues. It makes the war possible. The war is pretty sneaky, right? Polk tells Zachary Taylor to cross the river and then say that the U.S. was invaded, right? And he crosses the Nueces River. He claims he's fired upon. He claims that he's fired upon in American soil, and that starts the war. And so that gets some people upset with Polk for having lied in starting this war. So the question after 1848, after the accession of this land, is how to settle this landmass. And 1850 decides where freedom and slavery is, and basically it's the fight over the West that's going to lead us to the American Civil War, right? So the Whig Party at the end is basically almost broken. It opposed the war for Texas, and nobody is quite, we don't really have a strong, historians debate why the Whig Party declined. One answer is that if you oppose a war that the United States is involved in, it's basically a recipe for party suicide. Right? Just like the Federalist Party that opposed the War of 1812 collapses after the War of 1812. So some people say that if you're in a party and the party is opposed to a war that people are fighting, that this will be the end of your party. This is certainly what the Democrats thought in the first Gulf War, right? When the first Gulf War was declared, once it was declared, Democrats and Republicans all lined up to support the Gulf War in the House and the Senate, in part because Democrats thought that opposing a war once there are sort of American boots on the ground is going to be the end of your party. And so it's possible that that's part of the reason that the Whigs fell, is because the Whigs opposed the war for Texas annexation, and once the U.S. was engaged in that war, it was considered anti-nationalistic or sort of anti-national or traitorous almost to oppose a war that the U.S. is involved in. Does that make sense? Okay. Another explanation is that maybe Tyler ruined the party by becoming president and a Whig, and basically not doing anything the Whig Party promised. The Whig Party is incapable of doing anything for the 4 years that Tyler is in power. And then another explanation is that maybe after the recovery, after 1844, 45, 46, after the U.S. recovers from the 1837 panic, without a national bank, that the Whigs don't really have an issue anymore. Okay? In either sense, there's really not. We're down to one party in the United States. There's a Whig Party, but it's small, and so I want to get us to why that leads to secession and civil war. So let's start with the railroads. Okay? So I said that the question was going to be, how do we settle the West? And the way in which the West is going to be settled, it turns out, is increasingly by railroad. These are vast distances that have to be covered. And in 1851, this man, Stephen Douglas, figures out a way of making the. Oh, bear with me here for a second. Figures out a sort of somewhat complicated way for the U.S. to support railroads that are going to expand to the West. Okay? And how does he do this? All right. The plan is that the U.S. Congress has the land. It's going to turn it over to a railroad, right? A railroad company. Railroad company is going to sell land along the railroad as it's built, and it's going to make money from selling that land, and that's going to pay for the railroad. Okay? So there's a huge upfront cost for this railroad, like the Illinois Railroad, the Northern Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Atlantic Pacific. These are all railroads that are proposed between the 1850s and going into after the war. These are railroads that are proposed. Oh, sorry. What Stephen Douglas does is it figures out how to use railroads to settle the West. Okay? And he does this with the land grant system. And the land grant system, basically, if you look up here, those alternating squares, the U.S. keeps 1 square mile on one side, the railroad gets another square mile, and it's a sort of checkerboard pattern on either side of the railroad. The railroad in general doubles the price of land, and so the U.S., in giving half of the land away to the railroad, still comes out basically neutral. Does that make sense? The railroad will propose it, Congress will accept it, and then the railroad is going to take this land, it's going to sell the land north and south, and it's going to sell bonds. And there's a sort of complicated, basically what the railroad is going to do is it's going to issue bonds for the land that's sold. And people are not going to buy the land, they're going to buy it on mortgages. Okay, they're going to pay in installments. So if you're somebody from let's say Germany or Great Britain, and you want land in the West, you will promise to pay the railroad, what will you pay? 10% up front, and then the rest of the payment off in 4 or 5 years, all right? Just like the land office did, only now you're going to pay the railroad for this. The railroad's going to take that upfront money that you're using, and it's going to use that to sell bonds in Europe as well. And Europeans are going to buy these railroad bonds. They're going to pay $1 million, let's say, pay $100,000 and get $10,000 back every year for the next 11 years. Okay, does that make sense? So that's how the bond is going to go. So you're going to get a bunch of, the railroad is going to get a bunch of money from the investors. Right? Right? It's always the installments, right? So that's the installment plan that the railroad is going to do. So no more land office. Sorry, it's hard to explain. Let me see if I can do it again. Okay, so the railroad is going to get the land in this checkerboard pattern along the railroad from the government. It's going to then issue bonds, and so it'll get, say, $10 million in bonds. So it will sell $10 million in bonds. Investors will pay $10 million to them, and then they'll pay back $1 million a year over 11 years. Okay. So once the railroad is built, the bond holders will get $1 million a year for 11 years, having invested in themselves. So the cost to the railroad is $1 million a year for 11 years. It's going to get $10 million up front. Okay? Then it's going to go to a bunch of people who want to farm and say, okay, you're going to pay me $1 million now, collectively, all of you are going to pay me $1 million now, and $1.5 million per year over the next 5 years. And for this land that you're going to get that's going to be along the railroad and that's very valuable. So now the Illinois Central has $11 million. It's got $10 million from the bondholders, and it's got $1 million from the would-be farmers. And it's going to use that to build the railroad. And then it's going to take the payments from the farmers and pay back the bondholders. So the farmers are going to pay for the railroad. They're going to pay back the bondholders. The bondholders are actually holding mortgages for the railroad, for the land. Okay, does that make sense? So basically, it's basically putting the railroad as acting like the land office. It's simultaneously lending money, right? And yeah, it's lending money to farmers, but it's borrowing a great deal from bondholders. Okay, so this whole system depends on grain prices being high, and grain prices are super high starting in 1854, 53 and 54. So this is the system. Okay, let me just correct a couple of things that I said last time. I said that that it was 54-40 or fight. That is right. It was the 49th parallel, though, that was the agreed upon line, which is up here. All right. So Europeans are saying, we're going over to the U.S. to make them buy the land back from us that we were given in the first place, and we're going to make them work for it. Yeah. So who the people that who are they borrowing from? So the railroad is borrowing from the bondholders, and the bondholders are rich people in Europe that want to get 5 to 6% back from a railroad. Okay, those rich people are not going to buy bonds from states anymore because of the defaults, because all those states defaulted, but they will buy bonds from a railroad because the railroad is going to be built, or they believe it's going to be built, and they can see the land that's actually going to be used. So the railroad is borrowing from rich people in Europe, and then the railroad is also lending to farmers who are going to come over, settle the land, sell crops, and then pay the railroad back. Okay? So the railroad is like a bank, really. It's both a borrower and a lender, just like a bank is. Does that make sense? So when we think of a railroad, we think of a train. But in fact, the railroad is simultaneously a borrower and a lender. It is super crafty, right? This is super crafty. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, that's the plan for Western settlement, which is a huge problem. Like these distances are vast. Getting across them, if you've ever played the game Oregon Trail, you know that the likelihood of dying is very high. It takes a very long time to get to the west. A railroad to the west makes a whole lot more sense. And this is a highly leveraged financial system for settling the west. Okay? All right, so that's the plan. And a whole bunch of railroads are promoted in this way. A whole bunch of lobbyists descend on the United States in Congress to build out these railroads. They're going to make quite a bit of fortune using other people's money, using the money that's lent to them by bondholders. All right, it's kind of impossible. Okay. So that's the setup for the railroad and how the railroad this land grant system is going to work. Okay. Now let's talk about the party system. When we last checked, the Whig Party was in some trouble for a variety of reasons. It shrunk. So native populations are. It depends on who you are. So the Kansas Indians, for example, who are in Kansas, make a great deal of money selling this land. The Kansas Indians have moved there relatively recently. There are people who are displaced, but unlike Georgia, which is expanding through the Trail of Tears and things like that, there are technically payments made to those people who the land is taken from by the United States. Those people are relocated, but it's not a Trail of Tears in the 1850s. The land too is vast, right? And so what we're talking about is vast distances, and the number of people on these in Kansas who are native peoples are relatively small at this point. It's actually really relatively difficult to live in Kansas unless you're right along the river. Okay. Okay, so a new party comes along in 1844, recognizing that the Whig Party is declining, recognizing that no one that the number of people who are voting for the Whigs is small. They create this new party called the American Party. It's going to be neutral on slavery, and it's going to be an alternative to the Democratic Party. And this is also called the Know Nothing Party, because when people were asked what they thought of the party and how the party was organized and who they were running as candidates, they would claim that they know nothing. So the Know Nothing Party is it's organized very differently than other parties. It's organized in lodges rather than the way the Democratic and the Republican Party are organized. You join a lodge in the American Party, and you select your the candidates in secret. And let's take a look a little bit closer at this American Party image. What's going on here? What's the story of the American Party? What is their message? Protesting. Cut funding. What's the... Can you guys read that? What it's? Should I read this? What it says in the? All right, let me read what it says. Beware of foreign influence. None but Americans shall rule America. Bennington, Saratoga, Trenton, Princeton, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. We are bound. And then a black sign that says we are bound to carry out the pious intentions of His Holiness the Pope. And another black sign that says Americans shan't rule us, with a cross. And then another sign on the right that says Freedom, F-R-A-D-O-M, of speech, S-B-A-C-H-E, and action. Okay? And so the American Party is on the left and their opponents are on the right. Yes, so they strongly oppose foreign workers. And so what's the sort of message of this American? And you can read here at the bottom: opposed to papal aggression and Roman Catholicism, opposed to foreigners holding office. Nativism, right? The protection of American mechanics against foreign pauper labor. Foreigners having a residence in the country of 21 years before voting. Our present free school system, carrying out the laws of the state as regards sending back foreign paupers and criminals. Okay? And then it says here on the right, we are burdened by enormous taxes by foreigners. We are corrupted in the morals of our youth. We are interfered with in our government. We are forced into collisions with other nations. We are tampered with in our religion. We are injured in our labor. We are assailed in our freedom of speech. Okay, so it's an anti-Catholic party, right? It's an anti-Catholic party. So we've heard this a lot, and in fact, some people have claimed. I don't want to get too political here, but some people have claimed that one aspect of Trump's policy was a know nothing platform, which was a sort of anti-immigrant platform, and there were. Republicans who supported this and other Republicans who didn't, but immigration is certainly an issue that has divided Democrats and Republicans. Right. So this is the issue, the controversy. Okay. And as you can see, it depends on stereotypes of Irish immigrants as being, you can see here basically pirates with their daggers. Impoverished women with children. It depends, and you can see the Pope's Brigade of sappers and miners. And sappers and miners are people. Sappers are the people who break down walls by planting mines underneath walls. And so this is an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party. And this is the costume of the Know Nothing Party. The costume of the Know Nothing Party. They call themselves Native Americans, believe it or not. And they were descended, U.S. descended. They wore these top hats. They tended to be involved in brawls in the 1840s. They were anti-Catholic. Yep. And often against, sometimes against police. Yeah, a little bit like the Rude Boys. Yeah. Or Proud Boys. Very similar, right? They dressed in top hats. Oh, he's picking up bricks down there in the bottom to throw at the soldiers on the left. Okay, so these are sort of working class folks, but they're a little bit like the Proud Boys. They're willing to use force. They tend to be organized in gangs. Yeah, yeah, it is strange. I don't. Yeah, his head is definitely tilted up. I don't know what he's looking at, right? But that was the look: the checked pants or white pants, the long coat, the tailored jacket, and the tall hat. And they tended to be working class folks in this organization. And that's what the Native American Party is. So this is the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party is quite popular, and the Know Nothing Party, it aims to be a party that's popular in the South and the North. Okay, they believe that people who are opposed to the tremendous Irish immigration that happens in 1845 and 46 because of the famine, people who believe that all these Irish people who are coming in are too poor to work and are paupers and things like that. There's tremendous opposition to them in the North. In northern cities among workers and things like that, and tremendous opposition to them, or some opposition to them in the South as well. Okay, so it's an anti-immigrant party, and that's the Know Nothing Party. Okay, so we have another party called the Liberty Party that's also emerged, and the Liberty Party is much smaller and much less effective. It starts in 1844. Industrial Revolution in Britain is 1770s to the 1840s or 50s, but sort of the end of the British Industrial Revolution, but maybe the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. The Liberty Party proposes in 1844 is a tiny party. It proposes abolishing the interstate slave trade. Yeah, they were popular in the North and the South. It tended to be old Whigs, Southern Whigs, who supported the American Party. So if you look at the leaders of this party, it's people who were in the Whigs Party, who were Southerners, who basically believe that the Whig Party has sold out or is no longer useful, and they go into the American Party. It's also sort of northern working people who are not Irish, and so Irish folks tend to go into the Democratic Party. Mostly, not entirely. Okay. So the Liberty Party proposes abolishing the interstate slave trade. Right? So remember before we talked about how the Democrats feared that the interstate slave trade would be regulated. Well, that's precisely what the Liberty Party wants to do in 1844. They run in 1844. They get 10% of the vote. Martin Van Buren runs as president, a former president himself. And so the Liberty Party is tiny. The American Party is also is more like, seems to be more like 15%. Does very well in Baltimore. It does very well in Philadelphia. Does very well in New York City. It also does pretty well in southern towns and cities. It does well in Western Virginia and places like that. Okay. Now the Republican Party, though, has an interesting argument, and that is. This Liberty Party has an interesting argument, and that is the expansion of slavery of railroads to the west. Yeah, right. Okay, so let's then look at Stephen Douglas. Now, Stephen Douglas, remember, is the person who comes up with this land grant policy. And Stephen Douglas is also in it for himself, and he buys a whole bunch of railroad land, or land that he thinks is going to be along this railroad that's going to go from Chicago to the west, that red line there. He also buys a lot of land near what's going to become the Illinois Central. And Stephen Douglas does become a multimillionaire when he dies. So Douglas himself is making a considerable amount of money in his investments in Chicago, right? And he promotes the blue and the red lines, and he very much wants a line through the territory that's going to be Nebraska. So he wants that railroad to go all the way to California. The trouble is the F Street mess. The F Street mess, in 51, they authorize a couple of land grant railroads, but by 1853, they stop them entirely. And they say there will be no more land grant railroads. Because, why? Because this whole system is working too well. And it's bringing all sorts of anti-slavery people into Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and what's going to become Iowa is bringing lots of people in these regions. This, they say, is going to hurt Southerners. That Southerners, white slaveholders, are going to be in trouble because it's going to put more and more people in the House of Representatives and ultimately expand the Midwest, the northern Midwest, faster than the South. They try to build a couple of railroads. They try to build the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad and a couple of other railroads in the South, but they fail. Why would they fail? Why would railroads in the South fail? We talked about backward and forward linkages. What's the problem with those railroads in a place like Missouri or a place like Louisiana or Mississippi? Yeah, what's the difference? What's the problem with why is slavery a problem? This is from the look, all four of them. The look is definitely farms. Okay, no industry. Okay, right. So as Sakura is saying, the right, there's a lot coming in, but no going back. So in these slaveholding regions, people that are run by people like this, they're not buying enough goods, right? It's not the cities. The cities don't build up because the farms, people in the farms are not buying that much in the way of goods. Plantations just don't buy enough for there to be back and forth railroads. And so the railroads can't run back and forth. They have stuff to export in those slave regions, but they don't have stuff there's not bringing back enough goods for the railroads to work. Okay. So the railroads in the South fail in 52 and 53, and the railroads in the North succeed in 52 and 53, and for that reason the F Street mess puts a stop to it. Okay? But there's always somebody who's thinking ahead, and one person who's thinking ahead sees the blue and red lines that are being promoted by Stephen Douglas, and he thinks differently. He thinks that the blue line is going to fail because it goes through slave regions that aren't going to import or export. They're going to export, but they're not going to import that much. We're not going to bring that much good in. And he sees the red line, and he thinks it's too cold up in this region. And so he buys up the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which goes from Chicago to Springfield, and he buys up the Southern Railroad, the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad, for pennies on the dollar. Because both of them are in trouble, both of them have failed, he buys them very cheaply. Okay? Because he has his own idea about a railroad to the west. He has an idea for a railroad that's going to go through Illinois and Missouri. It's not. So you've heard of Forbes magazine? This is that Forbes. All right. One of the wealthiest people in the United States by the 1850s and 1860s. Yeah, the railroads weren't making money. And so his plan was to buy them up for pennies on the dollar, use that land. And he thought, well, Missouri is a slave state. I'll run it through a slave state, but then I'll run it through Kansas. What he wanted to do with all that land is sell it. He had no interest in it himself. He wanted to sell it. And he figured that Missouri was going to be a loss, but he's going to make money in Kansas. Does that make sense? And what's going to become Kansas? Okay. And that's when Stephen Douglas, right, sell it for the railroads. And that's when Stephen Douglas is approached by the F Street Mass. Stephen Douglas desperately wants this railroad. And he says, all right, what do I have to do to get you Southerners to support it? And they say, take that purple territory, which is at the time all called Nebraska territory, and split it in half between Kansas and Nebraska. Okay? Kansas can decide for itself, will decide for itself whether it has slavery or not. And Nebraska will also decide for itself. Okay? For slaveholders, the hope is that there will be slaveholders settling in Kansas, and that there will be a slave road that goes all the way to Kansas. A road where it's all the way to California, where it's possible to bring enslaved people over to California and maybe overturn the constitutional amendment in California. The Constitution in California that says there'll be no slavery there. I guess that's their hope, right? And so Douglas says, okay. But what he does is he breaks the 1820 Compromise and the 1850 Compromise. And that is, now that's, so basically he has sold out, right? He's a Democrat. He's candidate for president, but he has basically given in to the F Street mess, given them a railroad that might have slavery or freedom. Okay? Now, who's going to be the most upset about this? John Murray Forbes, right? John Murray Forbes' whole plan was that this territory would be free. The Compromise of 1850, Compromise of 1820, both of them suggested that this was going to be free territory. Splitting it this way and allowing Kansas to have slaves will make his investment worth nothing. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of political opposition to this, but a lot of people, some people don't care about Kansas. A lot of people don't care about Kansas. John Murray Forbes does. And so he creates the New England Emigrant Aid Company, he goes ballistic, and he and others fund anti-slavery New England emigration to Kansas. He's going to fund this, making it cheaper for people from New England to go to Kansas. They send rifles in crates marked Bibles. So the crates say Bibles on them, but they're actually rifles, to make sure that Kansas is a free state. If Kansas is going to decide for itself if it's free or slave, if the 1820 and the 1850 Compromise are going to be violated, Forbes is going to make damn sure that this is going to be free territory. And so he makes it easier for New England's folks to settle in Kansas. He provides them free transport over the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad, or the part of it that's constructed. It's not quite finished. And this is James Henry Lane, a partisan military leader, anti-slavery, strongly anti-slavery, who will lead partisan guerrilla forces in the settlement of Kansas. And so what we get then, yes, right. And so what we get then are two groups of people who rush to Kansas in 52. On the one hand are Southern pro-slavery settlers, supported by slaveholders, people from Missouri, who cross over just one day into Kansas to vote. And they are called, their critics call them border ruffians or pukes. And they're going to settle in the West, right? They bring their rifles. They bring And then they just come for one day to vote in the Kansas election, and then they go back to Missouri the next day. But they're going to drive out any anti-slavery folks. They're called bushwhackers most often, but also border ruffians and pukes. On the other side are the Jayhawks. The Jayhawks are Kansas free soilers, people who support no slavery in Kansas. They're called long-haired men and short-haired women by their opponents in the South. Right, exactly. Neither kind was especially pinky up type folks. Although to be fair, the Jayhawks did, men and women did settle there. They were obviously planning for the long haul to settle in Kansas. They were anti-slavery. Were they abolitionists? Some of them were. Some of them were very strongly abolitionists, but some of them just didn't want enslaved people in Kansas. They didn't want black people in Kansas. So, to be fair, these are not, necessarily the leading lights of abolition in this period. Some of them are strongly abolitionists. Some of them are anti-slavery, and some of them just don't want black people in Kansas. So this is the Kansas Free Soilers, as they're called. Does that make sense? So these people end up shooting at each other in Kansas. And this is one reason why the Know Nothing Party, which I talked about, looks less and less interesting, less and less important. More and more like, why are we concerned about the Irish coming in when people are shooting at each other in Kansas? No, there's not really family versus family. What we do see, though, is two constitutions. We see a pro-slavery constitution in at Lecompton and anti-slavery in Topeka. What do the Jayhawks want? The Jayhawks want cheap land in the West, in Kansas. They want to establish these settlements, and they want to make sure that there's no slavery in them. They want to make sure. So it's a complicated. The people who are the Kansas Jayhawkers, some of them are anti-slavery. Most of them are anti-slavery. Some of them are abolitionists, right? Some of them support immediate abolition, and then some of them also just don't, want Kansas to be a white state, right? So it's a complicated group of people, but they do want to settle there, right? The non-Indian settler population be considered. So they oppose the pukes because the pukes want a pro-slavery constitution, and the Jayhawks want an anti-slavery constitution. And so each of them, the way you're supposed to set up a territory is go in, you find 5,000 people, you come together, you have an election, and you create a constitution. There are two constitutions in 1855 in Kansas. One in Lecompton, one in Topeka. They're 25 miles apart, something like that. Those two places each call themselves the capital of Kansas, Topeka and Lecompton. Right? So basically that's how you create a state, right? Is you go in, it's a territory, you call yourself a territory, you create a constitution, and then you ask for state to be declared a state. So that's built into the Constitution. And so basically both of them are fulfilling their constitutional duties, but in two different towns that are 30 miles apart. Nice? And so this is where we get the sack of Lawrence. This is where we get riders coming in from anti-slavery, pro-slavery riders coming into places where anti-slavery folks are and just shooting up the town. This is where we get John Brown and his sons finding a settlement that's a pro-slavery settlement and killing the head of the family and all five people that are there, cutting them up with hatchets and just leaving their bodies and going back. So this is what we see in Kansas, is people literally fighting each other. It was a day's travel from Missouri. So from Missouri, if you look at Missouri here and Kansas, And this is where, like, this is like, 5 miles from the border. Both of these places, the capitals are five, not 5 miles, 40 miles or so from the border. So relatively close. Yeah. So this is in fact where we see the Wild West. Okay. So number one, why does the Liberty Party do well and the American Party not do well? Number one is Kansas. Number one is bleeding Kansas, the war over Kansas that started by Stephen Douglas. That's really a war in part about railroads, really a war in part by capitalist folks who've been involved in these railroads and are attracted to these cheap land in the West. They believe that slavery is a mistake, and they're willing to invest a lot of money to get other people to fight for it. Okay, so that's the first thing that helps the Free Soil Party beat the Know Nothing Party, is the Free Soil Party says, look, there is a slave power, right? Obviously, there's a slave power. The F Street Mess demanded this from Stephen Douglas. There's clearly was a slave power. Okay, number two, in Congress, Charles Sumner gets up and he defends the anti-slavery folks in Kansas. Bear with me here for a second. Charles Sumner gives a speech attacking Southerners who defend slavery. And he says that harlot slavery, he calls it. Slaveholders' love for slavery has led them to be dishonorable. And he implicitly attacks Preston Brooks, Andrew Butler. And he says that Andrew Butler in South Carolina is devoted to that harlot slavery. He's implicitly comparing his love for slavery with Andrew Butler's well-known slave mistress. Okay? This is a common thing among the South Carolina planters, is that they have enslaved mistresses. And Sumner knows this. And Sumner then refers to that harlot slavery. And he says and implies that pro-slavery Southerners are the kinds of people that are likely to use slaves for their own benefit. Yeah, he doesn't look that unhappy. This is, but in part, this is to sort of defend him. So Preston Brooks, who is a cousin of Andrew Butler, sees this as an imputation of miscegenation. He sees the claim that Andrew Butler is, and so among the wealthy gentry in the South, if you insult someone right under the code of honor, he does look like he's not that hurt, but he is badly hurt. So under the Southern Code of Honor, you're supposed to duel with a person if they're honorable. But Preston Brooks decides, he goes into Congress and he decides that Sumner is not honorable. And so he says, if you're dishonorable, then your response is to beat them like a dog. And this is what Preston Brooks does. He waits until Sumner is alone, and he then walks up to him while he's sitting in his seat. And Brooks is Senator Charles Sumner is quite tall, and it's difficult for him to actually sit in the seat. He waited for a woman to leave the gallery and then began whacking Sumner with a gutta-percha cane, right? Brooks hit him 30 times before other senators pulled him off. At the end, Brooks's cane and Sumner's head were covered with blood. Brooks later boasted, towards the last he bellowed like a calf. I wore my cane out completely, but saved the head, which is gold. The Southern response in Southern newspapers were that they widely supported the attack. The Richmond Whig called the caning of Charles Sumner elegant and effectual. The only regret we feel is that Mr. Brooks did not employ a horsewhip upon his slanderous back instead of a cane. Southerners in South Carolina and Georgia enslavers and others mailed him new canes. In the North, people were outraged, not so much by the attack as by the response in the South. The notion of free speech being violated gave tremendous boost to what starts out as the Liberty Party and then becomes the Free Soil Party. It gives a boost to the Republicans in the House and Senate elections. The third thing. The first thing is the Bleeding Kansas. The second is Bleeding Sumner and the attack on Sumner. The third thing is the Panic of 1857. And the Panic of 1857, it's complicated, but there is a financial panic in 1857, and it has basically to do with the end of the Crimean War. Basically, wheat prices go up again very rapidly when France and Britain fight against Russia in a war over Istanbul, over it's basically the control of Istanbul, and in that Russian grain is not getting to Europe, and without Russian grain getting up to Europe, the prices of grain go up 35%. That's right. That's right. Partly as a result of that, but more directly because this whole railroad system comes into question. What happens is that states start to contest the claims of the railroads for that same land. As the land becomes more valuable, as the railroads start to get built on them, states, using something called the Swamp Act, claim the land that's in these squares. They claim that this land was initially deeded to them by Congress in the Swamp Act. The Swamp Act says if land is swampy, states can drain it, and if they drain it, they can sell it. And so what you get is competing claims to the same land in between the states and the railroads. These competing claims between states and railroads call into question this whole system and whether the railroads actually own this. No, water and mineral rights depend on the state, but the big issue is that this whole system of taking mortgages and using it to pay for a railroad comes into question, and lots of Europeans stop buying these bonds and start selling these bonds. And this is another reason for the Panic of 1857. But with the Panic of 1857, the people who are hurt by the Panic of 1857 are Northerners, are the big cities. Philadelphia, New York, even Baltimore, they're hurt. You see 25% unemployment in those cities in the Panic of 1857. And the South, which is still exporting cotton, does very well. And so it's at this point that James Henry Hammond says, "You dare not make war on cotton. Cotton is king. If we were to stop growing cotton, the United States would fall apart. You need us. You need slavery. You need cotton." He kind of gloats about the Panic of 1857. These three things, the Panic of 1857, the caning of Charles Sumner, and Bleeding Kansas, lead people to flock into, many Northerners to flock into the Republican Party. Right? Yeah, there are a lot of panics. Most of the cotton at this point, I can't say, about 75% of the cotton that's being produced is being exported. Some of it is going south and up to Philadelphia, and not Philadelphia, to sort of, Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania and Maryland and New Jersey. But so some of it is going to cotton mills in those places. And Massachusetts, sorry, I forgot Massachusetts. So Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are the biggest importers of cotton in the United States. But the 75% of it is going to Liverpool, going to Great Britain, where it's being turned into cotton then. So people flock to this new party that calls itself the Republican Party. It starts out as the Liberty Party. Then in 1854, it changes its name to the Free Soil Party. And then in 1856, it changes its name to the Republican Party. And the Republican Party says, first of all, there's going to be no more corruption, like with Stephen Douglas. Land in the West is going to be, in large quantities, is going to be given out free to settlers. The other proposal is to take land and turn it into land grants, which we're going to pay for universities. Right? And the third thing is that that railroads are going to be nationally supported and nationally chartered, not chartered by states. Right? And so that is the Republican Party. The Republican Party is increasingly recognizing the sort of the militants of the slaveholding part of the South. Right? Yeah. No corruption except our corruption. And so they support. This is the Wide Awake Club. All right. And so this is the Wide Awake Club, and there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning about the Wide Awake Club, which is basically a party that's designed to attract young men into the party, men who can't even vote. Voting age is 21. You can join the Wide Awake Club at age 16. No, but if you look up, you go to memory.loc.gov, you can search for Wide Awake Club and you get and you can find it. So at the top is an I, and the I is a ripoff from the Know Nothings, the Wide Awake Party. That's a line. So the line, we think of it as a Masonic symbol, but in this period, it's a symbol of the Know Nothing Party. And what the Republican Party is trying to do is adopt symbols of the Know Nothing Party to draw people in. So allegedly, Washington said to in the Battle of Yorktown, the night before U.S. troops engaged the British, allegedly Washington said, "Let none but Americans keep watch tonight." In other words, we can't ultimately depend on the French to defend us. And so the Know Nothing symbol is the wide awake eye. And so this is something that the Republicans borrow from the Know Nothing Party. And so while they don't explicitly say that they're an anti-immigrant party, they borrow the language and the ritual from the Wide Awakes and the Know Nothing Party. In fact, they borrow a little bit of the clothing from the Know Nothing Party. The long coat, the tight pants, and the vest, and also instead of a top hat, you can see a top hat there on the left. They use this sort of chapeau, which is a French hat that was used during the Crimean War. If you look at the bottom, you see the eagle with its wings spread. On the left are cities that have manufacturing in them. On the right are railroads to the west. Ultimately, this means that the 1860 election will be a new party. A party that only ran one candidate, that ran a candidate in 1856, who failed, who didn't do very well. But in 1860, the Republican Party basically sweeps the North, as you can see here. Okay, let me shrink this down so that we can take a look at it. And this is what brings the war. This is ultimately what brings the war, is the Republican Party sweeps all the way through the North. Okay? The sense that the Southern Party is a party of slavery, that the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, that it's controlled by a few people, that it's that even someone like Stephen Douglas, who is a Northern Democrat, cannot be trusted because they're in the pockets of Southern planters. The fighting in Kansas, the creation of Kansas as a separate territory, is something that they oppose. The shooting of people back and forth over slavery in Kansas, they blame on Southerners, rightly so. I mean, they are the people who are sending people over just to vote for one day in the Kansas elections. And so what we see are four parties. that emerge, right? The Democratic Party splits down the middle between the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party. And this is going to be crucial because if the Northern and the Southern Democratic Party had stayed together, the red and the orange, it would have won the popular vote and the electoral vote. But by this point, there is no bringing the Democratic Party together, and they split in 1860, right? It looks just like the four caucuses that we saw in 1824, exactly. And here it's even much more pronounced. You can see the party of the Southeast, which is the Democratic Party. You can see the party of the North. There's no party of the West, though, right? There's a party of the North and the party of the South. And there's a party in the middle, and that's the Constitutional Union Party. And that's what the party that the American Party becomes. It renames itself the Constitutional Union Party, and it does very well in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But with four parties, the hope on the part of Democrats was that this was going to go to Congress, and the Congress would pass some amendments that would guarantee slavery in the South. But Lincoln wins the electoral vote, even though he's running against three parties. It's called Wide Awake Club. Wide Awake Club. Okay. With a hyphen, I think, in the... Okay. Lincoln wins with basically without, even though he's running against three parties, Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Sumner, and the Panic of 1857 together bring together enough people that they're able to defeat all three, basically the Southern, the Democratic Party, which is split, and the Constitutional Union Party. The split between Southern and Northern Democrats is also an explanation for the war, right? Because the Democrats do split at this point. Stephen Douglas leading the Northern Democratic Party, and who is it? Breckinridge, who's actually from he's from Kentucky, but he doesn't. It's not very well liked in Kentucky. They split. The Southern Democratic Party says the defense of slavery is the most crucial issue for us. Stephen Douglas says popular sovereignty is the most crucial issue for us. And the fact that those parties split in half means that the Republican Party does better, but it doesn't just do better, it wins. And it wins without going to Congress. And that means that Lincoln doesn't have to answer to anyone, right? He doesn't have to guarantee slavery in the South. Right? Yeah, no, like this is not like the Green Party. This is not like, these are parties, the Socialist Party that ran in they actually do win states. And so it's this. As Lincoln is being inaugurated, there's a lot of threats. At this point, Southern states are already arming for war. At this point, militia companies are organizing in the South. They fear that a Republican president will do a few things. First of all, and this is that he'll basically declare Kansas territory to be free. But more critically, he's going to appoint the Postmaster General. Right? That seems like the least significant issue. But appointing the Postmaster General means that he's no longer going to stop the flood of abolitionist mail into the South, which is something that Jackson did and everyone after him had done. But Lincoln was not going to do that. And so abolitionist literature was going to be allowed in the South. Critically, he was going to support a railroad to California. He was going to support the land grant, support to universities. He was going to support free land in the West. That's a kind of winning combination at this point. And he's unwilling to compromise. So what is it? Why is it that Southerners are arming in this period? There's three explanations for why white Southerners are willing to fight for slavery, why they're organizing, and why we get this sort of unity among white Southerners. Why is it that only in the South, only 30% of families own slaves, right? Only 30% of white Southerners owned slaves. So why would Southerners back in such great numbers the Southern Democratic Party, right? Why would they back the party of slaveholders when only 30% of families have enslaved people, right? So Heron folk democracy is this idea that there's a kind of race, right? That Heron folk is German for master race, or sort of this idea that that the thing that holds white people together is this. It's a sort of commitment to white supremacy. That's a So that's one argument, is that white supremacy keeps white Southerners together. That even poor white Southerners are dependent on enslavers for credit. They're dependent on enslavers for other things, and they're willing to support them. And so that's one argument that's frequently made. The second is the fire eaters. Right. The second is the fire eaters. And the fire eaters, that's a good question. I'll talk about states' rights in a sec. The second is the fire eaters, and the fire eaters are these folks, and these are people who supported secession when no one else supported it. They were talking about secession in the 1840s and the 1830s. And there's a way in which they increasingly declared that there was so much anti-slavery sentiment in the South that secession was absolutely necessary, and these people become the sort of spokesman as the divide between North and South comes up. The fact that they had predicted that there was going to be conflict over slavery in the 1840s seems to have made them seem prophetic. And these people, Lawrence Kite, Albert Gallatin Brown, and William Lowndes Yancey, sorry, that's a terrible. Let me just do quick styles here. There we go. Whoops. Editing on the fly here. And the third, and the one that does seem to be most concerning, if we read the letters of people who are non-slave holders in this period, is the fear of a black army, the fear of an army that will have the formerly enslaved in it. Now, states' rights. The question of states' rights is one that it is true that the Democratic Party, both North and South, supported states' rights. Let's go back to the election here. It is true that that's what that made the Democratic Party different from the others. Although, remember that Harrison Tyler, who was not Harrison Tyler, John Tyler, who was vice president and then president, was a strong supporter of states' rights as well, and he was a Whig. So it's not, but it is true that there was a difference on the issue of state rights. The thing that makes that problematic is that, for example, the Fugitive Slave Act basically forces states to chase after enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and states are kind of fined for not doing so. So it's the argument that the South is strongly in support of states' rights is somewhat problematic. The firing on Fort Sumter, which is the sort of thing that finally leads to others joining, is basically a conflict over South Carolina, which has collected all of these arms. What happens in each of the southern states is that these militia companies take all of the guns that are in the armories that have been reserved by the United States. The reason that the Confederate Army is armed in the first year of the war is because they've basically taken all of the arms that are in armories in Charleston and in New Orleans and elsewhere, which had been basically collected for the defense of the state, probably to prevent slave uprisings, or that was the fear anyways. all of those guns are already in the hands of pro-slavery people with 2 months after the election that brings Lincoln to power. That said, there are white Southerners who are poor white Southerners who did believe that the battle that they were fighting for was for the right of the state against the federal government. And when Lincoln called for troops, that they were being asked to fight against their own brothers. So while for the people who are, it's absolutely in the Confederate Constitution that the defense of slavery is the primary issue. The defense of slavery is absolutely the reason for why the Confederacy defines itself. It's really only later in 1890 that Jefferson Davis, who's president of the Confederacy, goes back and rewrites the history of the coming of the war as a history of states' rights. But all the Confederate documents at the time suggest that the primary issue is the defense of slavery. Other questions? Sorry, that was a lot. We have the Whig Party collapsing in the 1840s. And we have three events that help bring the Liberty Party and then the Free Soil Party and then the Republican Party up above the Know Nothing Party. And those three things are Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Sumner, and the Panic of 1857. Other questions? Bear with me here for a second. Yes. So that's a good question. That's a good question. They yes, by and large, they're created. So the separation into reservations is happening all the way up into the 1850s. It's not until 1868 and 1869 that we start to see what's called the Dawes Severalty Act, which tries to break up the reservations and turn the land over to private holdings. That's highly controversial because on the one hand, it gives individual families their own land. The downside is that it's possible to effectively defraud those people that are on reservations. Yes, and so for example, you'll see the slave-owning Cherokees that are willing to fight on behalf of the Confederacy, and Choctaws, whereas other anti-slavery Indians are going to fight on the Republican side. You're going to see many tribal groups divided north and south on this issue. So you, particularly in the West, you're going to see native populations on both sides. It's in the textbook. The Three-Cornered War is probably the best new book on that by Kate Nelson. No relation. But her book, The Three-Cornered War, I think that's the title of it, is probably the best recent book on this issue. Yeah, Megan Kate Nelson. Her book, The Union, the Confederacy, and the Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. It's called The Three-Cornered War, and that's definitely the best book on Native communities during the Civil War. The territories do fight. They do send soldiers in both sides. Yeah, there were anti-war groups in this period. Yep. And Walt Whitman, for example, there are other conscientious objectors who become nurses during this. There are religious communities, Quakers, although many Quakers basically say that this issue of slavery is too important to give up. So Quakers split. Some Quakers actually fight, and there are Quaker regiments in Massachusetts and Philadelphia. sorry, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and there are other Quakers who don't fight. Um, okay, thanks everybody. We're at 12:25. See you guys on Thursday.